Welcome to another episode of Software Explorations Concept Overviews. I am your host, Tech Coach Ralph. Today, we are going to be talking about test runs and test executions in the software development lifecycle. Let's get started. So test runs and test executions play a major part of the software development lifecycle. This is where we actually start to execute our test cases on the application. So let's get into it. All right, so like I said earlier, our topic is test runs and executions. So the definition of execute: carry out or put into effect a plan, order, or course of action. Keep that in mind. So what's our agenda for today? We are going to talk about what is a test execution. We're going to talk about the QA's role in the test execution step, the importance of test execution, the step in the process of test execution in the software development lifecycle, how it works in Agile, and we're going to do a brief review and reminder of what's in a test case and also what's in a defect report, and then some challenges that we run into when we are doing our test executions. So what is a test execution? The QA team is now able to conduct proper testing activities because they have the test cases, test data, and the testing environment. The testing team performs the test cases based on the test cases and test planning prepared in the previous phases, like test planning and test case design. Remember, we previously discussed those as well. We went over the test planning phase and the test planning and test case design phase. We also already went over the defect report. So we might be wondering, why did we go over the defect report, reporting defects, before we talked about test execution? Well, the reason for that is while we are executing our test, we will more often than not come into defects, and it is important that we know how to report the defects and the bugs that we find while we're in the test execution. So that's why we did the defect reporting before we went into the overview of the test execution. So what's the QA's role in the test execution step? Number one, QA tests the functionality and the usability of the new or the existing software before it goes live to ensure that it is bug-free as possible. You'll never be able to catch every single bug, but we definitely want to make sure that the most important parts of the application that we're releasing do not have critical bugs that are user impacting, giving users bad experience, which ultimately leads to costing the organization money. In addition, during the test execution step, we work closely with developers. We provide them feedback on what needs improvement in order to produce top quality programs, top quality softwares, top quality websites, top quality applications that meet our customers' expectations. We pretty much work for the customer through our company. So why is test execution important? During the test execution phase, we detect defects, we validate the functionality of the application, we provide quality assurance, we have risk mitigation, we confirm defect fixes, we use it for documentation and reporting, we use it for continuous improvement, compliance and regulations, and user satisfaction. So what's defect detection? This is the phase where we'll identify defects, bugs, and discrepancies between the expected behavior and the actual behavior. Just like we went over in our defects, software exploration, this is where it comes in, where during test execution, that's where we find what we expected to happen versus what is actually happening. Then we also find issues early, and that allows the developers to address those issues before they reach our users, reducing the risk of customer dissatisfaction and potential financial losses. We do not want dissatisfied customers, which ultimately leads to financial losses. During this phase, we also validate the functionality of our application. So what does that mean? We validate the software's functionality aligns with the defined requirements and the specification. So the list of what is supposed to happen, all the requirements, we're comparing it against that to make sure that they both line up. They're both in sync. We ensure that the software meets the intended purposes and provides the features and capabilities as we promised to our users. How about the quality assurance part of it? Effective test execution is a key aspect of ensuring software quality. It verifies that the software works as intended, and that minimizes the chances of malfunctioning, crashes, or incorrect behavior. Delivering high-quality software helps maintain the reputation of the development team and our organization as a whole. Risk mitigation. So test execution helps mitigate potential risks associated with software development. When defects go unaddressed, that can lead to critical issues after the release, resulting in downtime, security vulnerabilities, and customer dissatisfaction. Like I said earlier, we do not want customer dissatisfaction, because if they leave our product and go to our competitors, we are losing money and we are soon unemployed. You can proactively address issues and reduce the impact on the user. Now, test execution is also used to confirm that our bugs, that our defects have been resolved, validating that previously reported defects have been effectively fixed. So after you had your initial test execution, and then you find bugs, you find defects, you report them, the developers work on them, say that they've been resolved. Now you're going to execute your test again to validate that those reported defects are resolved. In addition, though, we would run test cases that are related to those fixed defects to ensure that reported issues have been resolved and that the fixes didn't introduce new problem. This is known as regression testing. Now, test execution is also used for documentation and reporting. It documents and reports the results of each test case that we executed. And depending on the software that we're using, it'll go down to the level of each step. So it's not just on a high level that, oh, this whole test case passed, right? It'll say, okay, the first step passed, the second step passed. Oh, it failed at the third step. It provides valuable information to stakeholders about the software's current state, the number and the severity of defects found, and the overall progress of testing efforts. So based on the system that you're using as well, your test case management system, it will show, like, based on the amount of test cases that we have, how many have been executed, how close we are to finishing, how many defects have been found, how bad those defects are, and it just gives a whole comprehensive overview of our status and our testing efforts. It also helps the stakeholders make informed decisions about the software's readiness for release. So based on the percentage of the tests that have been executed, based on the amount of defects that we find, based on the severity, because we might have found a lot of defects, but they're like not very serious, so we can roll forward with our release. Or it can be like, okay, no, this is very user impactful. It's a high priority, high severity. We have to fix this before we can do any releases. So it helps the stakeholders make those type of decisions. Test execution also leads to continuous improvement. It generates data that can be analyzed to identify patterns and trends in defects. So keep in mind, when we did our overview and our implementation of Report Portal, which tracks test executions, that definitely generates data for us, and it can analyze that data so we can see some trends, some patterns and trends in defects. Data can drive continuous improvement efforts, helping development teams identify recurring issues, root causes, and areas where the development process could be enhanced. So a lot of times we end up running into the same issue. For instance, I remember a lot of times when testing React, I would always run into the same type of issue, like when you go to click on a button or some type of element, and then the page totally turns blank, and then you look into the developer tools, and there was some type of error in the console. So having that in mind, knowing those type of things to test, being able to give the developers a heads up saying, hey, this has happened a lot in the past, usually on this step. Can you take a look at that before you release it? That way we reduce the chances of finding bugs. It also helps for compliance and regulations. In some industries, such as healthcare, finance, and aerospace, compliance with regulatory standards is mandatory. Test execution plays a crucial role in demonstrating compliance with these standards by validating that the software meets required specifications and safety standards. And just to touch on that a little bit more, at one of my previous companies, it was a healthcare company, and I was specifically brought in to help validate their software. That they purchased the software, but they had to configure the software. So I was brought in to verify and validate the configuration. It was a healthcare industry related job, so there were tons of FDA regulations around that, and we had to create reports and document the test execution, that it passed and the time that it passed, and all these details, all the steps that we went through. So it is very important. It became a major component of our testing efforts and our reporting efforts that we had to do when validating these softwares. Test execution leads to user satisfaction. By executing tests and ensuring that the software functions as intended, we contribute to the end user's positive experience. Users are more likely to trust and enjoy a software product that consistently performs well and meets their expectations. Like I was saying earlier, if every time they go to use it, they have issues, they're like, okay, I'm just going to go find another software. They're going to go to our competitor, and now we're going to be in trouble. So where does test execution fall in the software development lifecycle? So in the model, it'll fall after development. So it flows downhill after the developers finish writing their code and putting it in an environment. They are going to tell us that, all right, this is done. And now we're going to start all of our QA efforts, where we're going to, if we haven't done our test planning yet, we're going to do our planning, we're going to write our test cases, and we're going to start executing, and then we're going to be reporting defects and those back to the developers, and that process can take quite a while. In the V model, it runs in parallel with the corresponding development phase. So as the developers are doing something, we'll also be doing something as well. It's usually, at this point, it's usually when the development is done, because for test execution, it kind of has to happen when development is done, but we're able to work in parallel up to a certain point with the developers. Now, in Agile, which would include the Scrum, Kanban, it happens in iterations throughout the development process, right? So with Agile, which we'll get into a little bit more, you develop a feature, you send it for testing. And if that passes, then it can be released, or it can go to ready to be released. In the DevOps process, when you're using continuous integration and continuous deployment, it's part of the development pipeline. Automated tests are executed during builds. And then we can also see how the Agile process and the DevOps process, they kind of start to get closer and closer together. So executing tests in Agile. Short development cycles known as sprints or iterations are followed by testing cycles. Test execution happens within each sprint to validate the developed features and ensures that the software remains functional and free of defects as it evolves. So you build a little, you test, you deploy. Build a little, test, you deploy. So you build feature by feature. You're not building a whole entire application and then you're trying to validate the whole entire application. You're able to build the software in little bite-sized pieces called stories. And as you verify that that works as intended, you're able to release that and then move on to the next story. In some, depending on the industry or the company that you're working for, you might finish like all the stories in a sprint and then release that as one big, not necessarily big, but like you release all the stories together, right? Or you can release story by story to the production environment. It just depends on the company that you work for, the type of application that you're working on. For example, like certain applications you can deploy on a regular basis, right? But other applications, like usually in the mobile side of things, you're not really able to do that. You have to do it where like you have a bunch of features and then you have a scheduled release saying, all right, this mobile application is going out on this date, because sometimes you have to release it to an app store and then they need to approve it. Many different things that can happen. So it just depends on the type of application that you're working on, the type of company that you work for. How about with the DevOps process, when you're executing in a CI/CD pipeline, continuous integration, and continuous deployment? So automated tests are executed whenever the code changes are made and integrated into the main code base. Continuous integration involves running tests as part of a build process to catch defects early. Continuous delivery includes further automated tests to ensure code readiness for deployment. So let's touch on that a little bit, right? The tests in the CI/CD pipeline are specifically related around automated tests. While testing in Agile, that can include automated tests and it can include manual tests. But the important part in the CI/CD pipeline, when it's automated tests, it's going to be regression tests. It'll be unit tests, it'll be regression tests, where once you can run on the branch that the development is actively working on. That way, when let's say you push up a branch, right? And the tests are triggered, and if they pass on that branch, and now when you go into merge the branch into the main branch, those tests are going to be executed again to make sure that the code that you're merging into the main code base, it doesn't break any of the existing functionality, right? And same for the continuous integration. As you're making that build, the test run, it'll be the unit test, it can be the UI test, it can be the API test, whatever you have defined as your CI/CD process. For the build, those tests are going to execute, and based on how you have it set up, if it fails, it can abandon the build and you have to investigate what's going on. If it passes, then it'll merge the code and deploy the code. So let's do a brief review of our test cases so we can see how they play into the test execution, right? The test cases, there are a set of actions you can take to verify that a specific feature of the software is functioning. It determines the different features within the system are performing as expected, and it confirms that the system satisfies all related standards, guidelines, and customer requirements. How about reporting defects? When we report defects, we have to have our defect identification number. Usually that's assigned by the test case management system. Usually that's assigned by the test case management system. When you go to create a defect, it's going to automatically create a defect ID. It should include a description. the expected results, the actual results, the steps to reproduce this defect, the severity and the priority of the defect, the environment that the defect, the severity and the priority of the defect, the environment or environments that the defect presents itself in, any attachments like screenshots, things like that, logs, whatever can help to troubleshoot and resolve the defect faster. The reporter's information. So the person who's reporting the defect, if they need to be contacted for whatever reason, more information, and it should include the status and the resolution of the defect. If you need more details on reporting defects, please check out the video that we recently released about reporting defects. Like, these go hand in hand, because as you're executing your test, you're going to find bugs and defects that need to be resolved. So what are some of the challenges that happen during our test execution phase? A lot of times we have inconsistencies between environments, right? So it's very important to try to get our environments to match as closely as possible, because we might have something configured in our production environment, but in our development environment, it's not the same, and it can cause us to not be able to see things exactly as we should. We can have ambiguous requirements where the requirements, like, it can be taken either way, and then we have to make a judgment call. So it's very important, before you even get to the test execution phase, before you get to the test case writing phase, that we have our requirements that are clearly defined, so that we know what our acceptance criteria is. So when we do execute our tests, we have firm instructions on what we're doing. Sometimes we run into data setup complexities, because you need to stage data in order to properly execute your tests, and coming up with the data can be kind of complicated depending on the situation. So making sure you have good test data is very important. Then we also have reproducing intermittent bugs. So one of the challenging parts is when you see a bug, but you don't know why it's happening, it just randomly happens sometimes. So nothing is really random, unless, like, even in coding, right? When you are generating a random number, there's some type of formula behind it, right? And where you can even make it to always be a particular random number. But so there's nothing that's really random, but trying to reproduce bugs that you don't know what's causing it, that can be very troublesome, right? But one of the things that make a QA person amazing is that they are able to debug, and they're able to provide more information. They are able to find out what is causing a bug to happen, so that that intermittent bug becomes reproducible. And then, of course, there's always time constraints, especially when working in Agile. The time constraints usually happens where you get closer to the end of the sprint, and as the developers are done, you kind of feel like you have less time to you kind of feel like you have less time to properly test the stories. But that comes with the way that you work with your developers, the way that you negotiate, the way you set expectations as a QA engineer on, this is the amount of time you need to test, and if we do not get this here in this amount of time, these are the situations, these are how we can mitigate the risks. So in conclusion, we spoke about what is test execution, your role as a QA engineer in test execution, why test execution is very, very important, right? And where test execution falls in the different types of the software development lifecycle. We zoned in a little bit more on testing in Agile and how test execution works in the CI/CD pipeline: continuous integration, continuous deployment, or continuous delivery. We also did a brief review of what are test cases and what's included in the test cases. And we also did a review on defect reports and what's included in the defect reports, why it's important to know what's included in both during the test execution step. And then we also went over some challenges and how to mitigate those challenges during the test execution process. So that is it. Hopefully you came out with more informed with how the test execution process works during the software development lifecycle. specifically in the Agile methodology and in the continuous integration and continuous delivery process. It is important as QA engineers to be able to highlight this information, to be able to clearly communicate this information to your teams, to your developers, so they can know where you are at in the process and that they can have a better understanding. A lot of times I hear that people in QA say that they feel like QA is not important, that it's undervalued, and all these things. But I think that's because we do not clearly express ourselves. We do not clearly express the value that we bring to the team. So when we're able to articulate ourselves in the test planning phase, writing the test scenarios, working with our developers for our building our test cases, when we are executing our test, and when we are writing and reporting our defects, all of that has to be communicated and has to be articulated clearly, and then you will be able to bring more and more value to your team, to your organization, and you're going to see how your team looks at you differently because you are confident and you are properly articulating yourself. So I hope you found this information helpful. If you found it useful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend, share it with a coworker who would also find this useful, and hit the notification bell so you can be notified when we release new content and when we go live for our software exploration or our Q&A journeys. But until next time, friends, this is Tech Coach Ralph signing off.
If you enjoyed the fascinating information shared in this video and you want more, be sure to hit the subscribe button to Tech Coach Ralph to be notified for new videos.